In 2023, I introduced you to pine shavings as my favorite mulch for the vegetable garden. And in that 2023 garden, I put pine shavings everywhere. I've learned a whole lot since then, and I've done a lot of experimenting. Today, I want to answer the question, is pine shavings still my favorite mulch in 2025? You probably won't believe what's happening in my garden right now. So stick around because what I'm gonna share may just change the way you mulch forever. So in 2023, I created this video about the best mulch for the vegetable garden. And in that video, I used pine shavings and pine flakes that I got from my local tractor supply store. And I put it around my herb garden to start with. And from that point, after that video, I actually wound up adding it to the entire garden. Now, what happened was I grew in my 2023 garden and into the early part of 2024. But I wound up selling my house and I had to tear my garden down really quickly, which was really sad. But I didn't get to do the update about how well that mulch was working a year later like I planned to. But I can tell you that that mulch did really, really well. I wound up planting in a lot of those beds about 3 times before I moved out of that location. And to be honest with you, I really loved the pine shaving. The pine flakes were great too, but the pine shavings did really well when it came to staying in place. They did a little bit better than the pine flakes. But again, both of them are great options. They're pretty much the same thing. The difference is pine flakes are a little bit bigger than the pine shavings. And you can get these at your local tractor supply store. They're something that you would use as a bedding for your young chickens, but they have a lot of other uses. One of them being mulch for your garden. So 2 years later, it's 2025, I have a brand new garden, I'm adding mulch to my garden right now, and the question is this still my favorite mulch? And the answer to that is yes. I still love pine shavings as a mulch in the vegetable garden. It stays in place. Pine shavings, once you put them in your bed, once you put them wherever you're growing, they're gonna stay there. Now, a big wind can come along, maybe move them around a little bit, but for the most part, they're gonna stay there because they're so small, because they're so fine. They cover a lot of area and they're really cheap. I get a giant bag that will cover more than one bed for about $7 and they last a really long time. So when I left my house in North Carolina, I had been using pine shavings in the garden for about a year. And like I said, I had done 3 plantings in most of those beds. And the pine shavings didn't even look like they were beginning to decay. So they are something that's gonna last a really long time. And yeah, there's a little bit of an investment at first, but $7 for a giant bag that will cover about a bed and a half, that's a 4 feet by 8 feet space, that's a huge savings when it comes to most of your other mulches. Pine shavings are incredibly absorbent. They're really good when it comes to water retention. So what they do is they hold onto that water and release it slowly into the soil as your plants need it. So I found that a fairly thick layer of pine shavings saves so much time when it comes to watering my garden. And I almost don't have to water at all unless there's like a big drought or something that's happening, unless there's a long period of time between rains. But for the most part, I really don't have to worry about watering too much as long as I have those pine shavings in place. And I tested this water retention out here in my 2025 garden when I planted potatoes earlier this year. And my potatoes did so amazingly well. That water retention was absolutely crazy. I was having to water the front garden bed all the time, but I was not having to water my potatoes that were growing in 5-gallon grow bags. And that's crazy because normally when it comes to container gardening, you have to water a lot. But by adding those pine shavings, I didn't have to water at all. A couple of times I did add a little bit of water just to kind of make sure that they were doing well, but I probably could have gotten away without watering at all. The other really cool thing about these pine shavings is they help keep the soil cooler. Now, this is really beneficial in my area. I'm in Florida. The sun is intense and it's gonna get really hot here. It's already getting pretty warm and we're just in March. But as we continue through the growing season, it's gonna get really, really hot here. So anything I can do to keep the roots of my plants a little bit cooler is gonna be beneficial because it's actually gonna extend my growing season a little bit. In the heat of the summer here, plants don't do well. Most of the United States, has a massive garden growing in the summer. In Florida, that's kind of the time where we can't grow very much. But I'm hoping that these pine shavings will actually keep that soil cool enough that I can extend my season into the heat of summer. The weed suppression when it comes to pine shavings is huge. And to be honest with you, when I use pine shavings, I don't really have to weed at all. And for me, this is a really big benefit. I talk a lot in my videos about how time is a very valuable resource for me, and I don't have a lot of time. I don't have hours and hours to come out and weed my garden. So using something like pine shavings that's super cheap, super cost effective, and means I don't have to weed and I don't have to water, this is amazing. The other really important thing about pine shavings is there's no seeds and there's no herbicides. So if you've hung out with me for any length of time, you've probably heard me talk about the disaster I had of some contaminated straw. And what happened was I wound up getting some straw that had been sprayed with an herbicide. I didn't realize this until it was too late and had already contaminated my soil. I added the straw to my garden. My tomatoes did not do very well. My beans did not do very well that year. And I realized by doing a lot of research and just kind of looking at my plants and the ones that were affected that it was an herbicide contamination. And this is something that can happen with straw or hay. The other thing that happened is as that straw began to degrade, a lot of weed seeds began to germinate and pop up in the soil. And this was so frustrating. I had built raised beds and put straw in those raised beds, and then I'm fighting to get rid of weeds because the straw that I had put on the beds was full of weed seeds. So to be honest with you, I do not use any straw or hay in my garden anymore because of that. And I tried a few other things after that before I settled on pine shavings. I actually tried pine straw. And I got a lot of pine straw and I added that to the garden, and that worked okay, but it was really pokey and I stabbed myself with it a few times. And it was just kind of hard to work with, and it stayed in place, but it was just hard to put down. It was hard to move. It was hard to work with. So I decided I did not like pine straw either. Then I tried leaves. Now, leaves are my second favorite mulch option because leaves do stay in place fairly well. They can blow around a little bit with the wind, but if you crush them up, they stay in place pretty well, and they're easy to source because everything is dropping leaves in the fall, so you can grab those up. Also, they're free. So who's not gonna want a free mulch in their garden that's easy to source? So for that reason, leaves are my second favorite choice, but they don't have the water retention properties that pine shavings do. They don't keep soil as cool as pine shavings do. So pine shavings are still my first go-to choice, but leaves are a close second. And this year in my 2025 garden, I'm adding pine shavings throughout the entire garden. And adding all of these pine shavings to my garden is probably gonna keep me from having to water my plants at all. Now, I will say we're coming into the rainy season in Florida. We do probably get a little bit more water than most places in the United States, but it's still a really great way to reduce the amount of water that you have to use. I've thought about things like drip tape and adding that in. There's a huge cost when it comes to that. So if I can avoid having to water or water minimally by adding pine shavings, it's so much more cost effective than adding drip tape or something like that to your garden. And in most cases throughout the United States, like I said, unless you deal with a major drought, adding pine shavings to your garden, you're probably gonna have to not water at all, or if you do, it's gonna be very minimal. Something else that I'm gonna try the next time I plant in these beds is burying the pine shavings deeply. This is really cool because of the water retention properties of the pine shavings. If you put them deep in your raised beds, they will actually help hold on to that water, release it into the soil over time. And so by burying these down deeply, as your roots begin to penetrate the soil and go down deeper, there is going to be water for them to find because those pine shavings have held onto it. So this is something you could definitely try. So while I'm telling you that pine shavings are the greatest thing ever, and I love them in the vegetable garden, there are some things to keep in mind. One of the things that we worry about with adding something like pine shavings to the soil is technically they're a wood chip, although a very small one. And because of this, they're very high in carbon. And if you get them mixed in your soil, the fear is, or the worry is, that they can actually temporarily rob the soil of nitrogen to help them break down in that space. And so it would temporarily tie up the nitrogen that's in your soil, and your plants might suffer from not getting enough nitrogen. This is something I worry about because one of the problems with pine shavings is they can easily get mixed into the soil. They do fine for that first planting, but when you go to plant that second or third time, especially if you're starting by seed. You have to pull the pine shavings back, and it's really easy to get a lot of them mixed into the soil, which theoretically should lead to your soil being lower in nitrogen because the nitrogen is tied up for the breakdown of the pine shavings. But I had a lot of commenters tell me that they never dealt with this issue, something they didn't even worry about. So I began to do a lot of research, and what I found was they're right. While pine shavings do technically rob the soil of nitrogen as they begin to decay and break down, this is going to be a subtle loss. And if you're doing things like amending your soil at the beginning of the season, if you're adding compost, if you're adding fertilizer, if you're keeping that soil well amended to begin with, you're probably not going to have a lot of issue here. So if you notice that you get your pine shavings mixed into the soil, one of the things you can do here is add a little bit more fertilizer to that space and maybe add a layer of compost on top of the pine shavings so that when you go to plant your seedlings in them, they germinate pretty well and they have some nutrients to begin growing. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to using pine shavings in the garden is that you don't want to put it over your seedlings before they've germinated. So it's fine to add around your plants once they've germinated and they've begun to grow a little bit. But if you put it over the top of your seedlings before they sprout, they're not going to be able to push up through those pine shavings. So in conclusion, pine shavings are still my favorite mulch in 2025. As I've been using them over the years, I actually like them a whole lot more than I did when I started. And let me know what mulch you're using in your garden, what experiences you've had, whether it's pine shavings or maybe you have something else that you absolutely love. Share it in the comments below. As we share information with each other, we're gonna learn so much more. So let's keep the conversation going in the comments. And thank you guys so much for watching. I'm gonna leave a video on your screen until the next one comes out. May your garden be full of grace and may you be abundantly blessed. We'll see you next time. Bye.